Okay, here we are with Robert Donoghue and Johnny Walker. Bob, what is your date of birth?
December 25th, 1946.
And you, John?
June 23rd, 1944.
Well, there you go.
I spent most of my years, growing up years, were on, we used to call it 11 Elm Street, right in the village.
And where else did you live?
Well, then I lived there most of my time until I got married, and then I lived on Davis Lane. And then we finally bought a house on Green Street in Sabattus, the old Charlie Gardner's old house. And we lived there until almost 40 some years, and then now we live on Lisbon Road, Sabattus.
And how about you, Bob? Where have you lived in the town?
In the town of Sabattus, I grew up at what was called Pleasant Street, now called Hemlock for some reason, I don't know, because there's no hemlocks on the street. Route 9, now called Middle Road. And most recently we built a log home up by the J. Cartier on Route 132.
What was life like in town during your preteen years when you was just a young fella?
Well, that was back in the 50s.
Right.
And the 50s was, in my opinion, a prosperous time for kids. I mean, we had stuff, we wasn't poor. The economy was improving. I lived next to school, so getting to school was not a problem. We lived right next door to it until they built a new elementary school. I feel like we were very lucky to be living in that era. It was a good era.
The war had ended, the men were coming back, and the economy was growing, and demand for refrigerators and stoves and all the stuff you couldn't get during the war. So it was, people were working, and it was just, again, of course, people are having babies. The baby boom was starting, and it was it was a busy, busy time, but it was a wonderful time to be a young child in town.
Okay. And Bob, you mentioned you lived right next to the school.
Yes.
So how many places in town did you go to school?
1 year there on Green Street, and then the next 5, 6 years I went to the elementary school, which was open when I moved into the first grade, and then down to the high school on Main Street.
I went to that school that he's talking about there on Pleasant Street, the little school, and went there for, I can't remember, I don't know, it was 2 or 3 years. And then at the time, the new school wasn't built yet, so you used to go down and go to the high school. Yeah, I think, I don't know, maybe starting at the 2nd or 3rd grade, I think you went to the high school. And then they opened up the new school, so the grammar school went back down to what we call the new school on the Pond Road, and then back up to the high school for the graduation for the high school years.
Early 60s, I graduated in 65. It was also, in my opinion, a prosperous time. There were problem areas in the country, but they never seemed to get at this area, like drugs and those type of things. We never heard of that. So John and I and the sports kind of control our life, mainly basketball, which is that, and baseball was the only thing that the high school had for us, but we enjoyed it very much playing together.
Like Bob said, we used to play basketball all year long, because it was one of the few sports that you could get involved in that didn't cost you an arm and a leg. All you need is a hoop and we had a hoop on the side of the barn, and every kid in the neighborhood came up there, and we'd have awful battles playing ball against each other. But we learned an awful lot, and it turned out we got into high school, we had a halfway decent team.
Hayloft at Waterman's Farm. That was our other basketball court. That
No
we
winner.
frequent.
That was our winter court.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Donald Waterman mentioned that to me just the other day. Yeah, that you guys went and practiced there.
Yeah.
I'll be getting into some of that later, by the way,
Okay.
Bob. What has changed the most in this town?
Well, I've thought about that question, and to me, the first thing that comes up, there was a different social attitude in the town. We were more, I think, at least section of the town that I lived in, was more of a family-oriented type thing, you know, where everybody knew everybody else. You could literally, in your mind, go up one street and down the other and knew where name everybody that lived there. And it was a great community to grow up in. I mean, if you were in any kind of trouble or get hurt, there was just like family members everywhere that could help you, that helped you out. It was, and you knew everybody. Like today, half the time we don't even know who our next door neighbor is, let alone, associate with them. But back then it was more community. I think a lot of it had to do with all the guys that came home back from the war. I keep going back to that because they knew the value of life when they saw so much destruction and they saw Europe being torn apart and families and everything like that. So when they came back, it was coming back to a family, not only their own personal family, but a community. And I think a lot of that had a psychological effect, especially on us kids growing up.
But I know we have spoken before, and you always seem to mention about the rivalry from the two sides of town. And you always used to have competition.
Oh yeah, that's true. Because as we were younger, you didn't have the video games, and TV was new, but you didn't spend all day on a summer day in town inside watching TV shows. You were out playing. You could hardly wait to get together in the morning with your friends. You had a gathering spot somewhere. You always just go there. And we'd first get there, well, what are we going to do today and stuff, and it usually ended up with some kind of a sport or competition, and there seemed to be a friendly competition, at least I thought it was, between one part of town against the other part of town, and they were usually better at baseball than we were, and they'd always beat us, the guys from the other side of town were always better at baseball than we were, and we had some of our strong suit was basketball and football, but this wasn't organized. It was just get together,
Bob, do you remember you and John practicing and everything so you could come down to the other part of town and whoop them?
Yeah. Well, as John said, in baseball, we kind of always was on the wrong side of things. But that was because Charlie Jolson lived in that end of town. We tried to recruit him to the north side. That didn't happen. But yeah, the town, as I remember it, we didn't have a whole lot of activities. We created them. Some of them just spontaneous. Amongst us kids, the kids went and put together a plan and generated a baseball, Little League baseball team. I remember we went and saw Leo LaBurge to become our manager, which was great because he was great with kids. We even had uniforms after a few years. as I mentioned, we used to use the facilities that were available to us, like Waterman's hayloft. Yeah, there was a rivalry between the two, but I think it was a friendly rivalry. You know, half hour after the game, we'd be all buddies again.
Anything to add to that, John?
Yeah, as Bob was talking about that, I realized that, you know, you get into some pretty heated, you playing ball, or, you know, somebody say you're out and the other one say I was safe and all that, and then, but you had a pecking order back then. You know, there's no adult coming in and refereeing. There was just us kids, but there certainly was a pecking order. You know, I mean, you pushed your point to the point where, well, this could lead to some physical altercations here, but you all usually you stop before you got to that point, and the bigger athlete, the stronger person, usually ended up getting his way, right? But that was what you learned. That was part of growing up, and we didn't have somebody. Usually, you didn't have anybody running home to us. Oh, somebody said something mean to me. You didn't do that stuff. You know, it was just you went on. The next time, like Bob said, the next time you get up there, or after the game was all over and the decision was made, you were all buddy. You were off doing something else together, and he might be on your team next time. What's better, to say, no, you were right, or a punch in the nose? You know, so it was. Yeah, it was a good time. I think we learned a lot of life's lessons back then.
Do you remember anything about a stink bomb in Mrs. Smalley's English classroom?
Yeah, you know, I've gone through a whole lifetime feeling like I was unjustly accused. But as my mind changed, usually for the worse, those memories do come back. So yeah, it didn't happen. And I remember Mr. Toothaker coming into the room. Mrs. Smalley thought it was a experiment gone wrong in the lab next door. So she went and got Mr. Toothaker, and he came in and caught it right off. And so he says, Mrs. Smalley says, I suggest you tell them they're all going to get detention until we know which one said it. And there was a certain girl, he hadn't finished his statement, but she
ratted you out.
Ratted me out. So. Yes, that did happen. I'm not proud of that, but it did lead me to a career in politics for a while.
How about you, John? Did you get any others?
I was an angel, actually. No, it's yeah, we had different things that we did, and like Bob said, they were not proud of them, but it was the way we did them. Yeah, it was all preparatory, I think, for our.
None of those come close to activities that occur today that you see in the news. I mean,
Oh yeah, that's right.
putting a stink bomb, sulfatab on the teacher's desk. Nobody got hurt. I lost some time in detention, but nobody got hurt. I mean, that was the type of things. I mean, the worst case, maybe somebody cussed somebody else, but it was different than today.
Yeah, there was no knives and guns and, I mean, none of that stuff. It was,
The basketball team, at least for 2 straight years, put in a pretty tough quest to get to the state title.
Well,
That
was the great. It was a great time. I mean, boy, I think if I could put time in a bottle, like the song goes, there it would be that time. It was so much fun, and actually, it was prolonging our childhood because our early years consisted of playing sports, and then to bring it into high school where we could really show off what little talent we may have had, to the public, and It was great. It was absolutely great. Even when we get made and played in the tournaments near the finals, it was even on the radio. We thought that was a big deal. That was Stevens hardware store there. He sponsored it, and it was on the radio. Boy, that was big time for this little town of Sabattus, you know. And we didn't have any really big organized plays and all that, but we'd played so much together that we knew the moves that everybody was going to make, and it actually worked out pretty good for us. I think that was the beauty of sports, you know, and you don't always win. You learn to lose gracefully as much as possible, as you know, and then you learn to win. And I think that carries on into life. You know, you're not always going to be the top dog, and you got to learn to accept the fact you're not. And then you have those good days. You try to be humble because you remember the times you lost. So good life lessons in sports.
John said that was a pretty exciting time for Sabattus and Sabattus High School, you know, getting into the tournament and getting to the championship games. As an example of how it changed, there was a lawyer that lived on Green Street. I'm sorry, Elm Street.
Yep.
Just a couple houses up from Johnny. He didn't know me. I don't think he knew you other than the brat that was a couple houses up. After that game, Johnny and I were walking down the street, and he came out of his house and beckoned us to come in. I thought, God, what have we done now? But
Yeah.
he wanted to congratulate us
Yeah.
and get more information about the basketball team. So that's how much it had meant to the town. There was people, you know, that came to games that had never been to a basketball game before, I don't think, but showed up. So but now is a small accomplishment that we did. I think it had quite an influence on us, especially, but the whole community.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, that was Mr. Woodside. He was the town lawyer. He was a lawyer for the town.
Tilson Woodside.
Yep.
Yep.
And I remember him as a kid because he lived like Bob said, a couple of houses down from where I lived. And I remember as a little tot, I sold the Grit magazine, the newspaper, and he was like, you know, I went over and I kind of reluctant to ask him if he wanted to take the Grit. Oh, he's, oh yes, I'll take it. And yeah, he was just a nice guy. They didn't have any children of their own, and but that was true. And I think of that often. He was an elderly man then, and invite us in. He said, "Come into my office." He brought us right into his nice office, you know, lawyer. We thought, who? And he brought us in there, and he wanted to know all about the game. You know, it wasn't put on or anything. He was sincerely interested in it. And he didn't go to the games because he was elderly, but I'm sure he listened to that game on the radio. And he was really impressed. And I can remember him saying, he says, yeah, my dad had, of course, wasn't living at the time. And he made us, it stayed with me all this time. He said, boy, your dad would be some proud of you, know. And that, but that would probably been the only thing my dad would have been proud of me of. But yeah. And another one thing you said, kind of an open question here, and something I thought about earlier, but I didn't talk about it, was that Scouts, the American Legion was very instrumental in doing things for the town, and they sponsored the Drum and Bugle Corps. Boy, when we had, there were a lot of people would turn out for the parade on Memorial Day. I mean, and we had our own little Bob played I think he played cymbals, didn't you, Bob?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I finally got a chance to play the drums, snare drum, and oh gee, that was great. But that was the American Legion did that, and they also used to have. This goes back quite a ways. They used to have what they call lawn parties. You remember the lawn parties? Yeah. They had lawn parties, and they'd have it right in between. It used to be the KP Hall and the Town Hall. There was a grassy area in there, and they had tents set up, and they'd have all these little games set up that penny toss and all that stuff. and then at night, at the end of it, they would block off that section of street and have a street dance right there. And I thought, wow, you know, boy, that was big time. That was big time for that. And but this is the type of town that we had. You know, everybody turn out for stuff like that. And then the American Legion, they bought what they used to call it the farm, and out by where Bob lived, yeah, out on 132, and the Scouts used it. You know, when we had our different things, and then upstairs they had a dance hall. And I can remember the guys, most of them were guys who returned from the war. They were young men then, and they had their own band, you know. Played saxophone. Yeah, boy, it sounded pretty good, I thought, as a kid. You know, this was a great community when it came. We had our faults like everybody does, but, you know, it's sad to see that sense of community doesn't seem to be alive anymore here. I'm hoping maybe someday that turn, but maybe that's just wishful thinking.
Well, we'd like to thank you guys for your time. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for kind of starting this historical society. I enjoy seeing things on Facebook. I think it's Facebook or your own website.
We have a Facebook page, we have a website, and we have a YouTube page.
YouTube.
And you can find a YouTube one, you just type in Sabattus Historical Society and it'll bring you right to our page. And hopefully most people will subscribe.